For years, Mark believed that his father had left the world with nothing more than a faded reputation, an empty house, and debts that seemed to multiply even after the funeral. Yet on the morning he returned to the family estate, carrying a box of unsorted papers his aunt had handed to him in a rush, he stumbled upon something that instantly changed the air he was breathing. Wedged between outdated tax receipts and yellowed letters was a thick leather-bound journal, its cover scratched, its lock broken long ago, its edges smelling faintly of smoke as if it had been pulled from a fire. For such a small object, it carried a weight that made his hands tremble. The first line, written in his father's unmistakable sharp handwriting, struck Mark harder than the tolling of church bells. "If you are reading this, then my enemies have outlived me, and I can no longer protect you from the truth." Mark sat at the wooden desk that still bore the scars of his father's temper: knife cuts, cigarette burns, rings from forgotten whiskey glasses, and flipped through the pages. What he expected were regrets, maybe personal confessions of infidelity or bad investments. But what he found was closer to an indictment. Names appeared, written clearly without hesitation: business partners, family acquaintances, even relatives. Each name carried a story, an accusation of betrayal, fraud, or conspiracy. His father had not written like a man confessing sins, but like a man collecting evidence. Every page felt like a courtroom, every sentence a verdict. Mark felt his throat dry as he realized some of these accusations were aimed at people still living, people who had come to the funeral, shaken his hand, and offered condolences with convincing sincerity. He could still see their faces lined up by the casket, mouthing polite words while perhaps knowing what was buried in this book. One particular entry made him stop breathing for a moment. It read, "My brother Charles pretends to be my ally, but it is his hand that guides the knife. Without him, the business would have survived. Without him, your future would not be threatened." Charles was Mark's uncle, the man who had helped raise him after his mother died, the only relative who had stood by him during college, the same man who had slipped him cash when bills were piling high. The accusation felt like poison. Could his father have been delusional at the end, or had Charles's loyalty been nothing more than a mask? Mark wanted to close the journal, to push it aside and never read another word, but curiosity and fear bound him tighter than chains. As the day turned to dusk, he read entry after entry, and with each paragraph the image of his father changed. He was no longer the broken man who drank himself into silence. He appeared instead like a hunter cornered by predators, recording names in one last attempt to strike back after death. By the time night fell, Mark realized that he was not simply holding a relic of the past. He was holding a weapon, a book capable of ruining lives if its contents ever surfaced. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from his cousin Leah. "Uncle Charles wants to meet tomorrow to discuss the estate. Come early." The coincidence sent a shiver down his spine. Did Charles know the journal still existed? Had his aunt intentionally slipped it into his box, or had it been a mistake? Mark placed the journal into a drawer, locked it, and paced the room like a prisoner awaiting trial. Every sound outside, the creak of the old gate, the echo of footsteps on the gravel, sounded sharper, almost threatening. He imagined neighbors peeking through their windows, acquaintances whispering, everyone watching to see if he would discover what he was never meant to know. Later that night, he dreamed of fire. The old house was ablaze, smoke filling the air, pages curling into ash while a faceless figure laughed from the doorway. He awoke sweating, clutching the drawer key in his fist as though it might vanish. The journal had already infected his mind. At dawn, Mark made coffee but could not taste it. He sat again at the desk and reread the final entry. His father's words were no longer just ink on paper. They were a command: do not trust them. If you remain silent, you will inherit only ashes. If you speak, you may inherit enemies more dangerous than fire itself. And at that very moment, the bell rang at the front door. Mark froze, heart pounding. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the silhouette of a man standing stiff, tall, and familiar. It was Charles. Charles entered the house without waiting for an invitation, brushing past Mark as if he were still a boy and not a grown man standing in his father's study. His cologne mixed with the scent of dust and stale whiskey, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and suffocating. "This place hasn't changed," Charles said, glancing around, his eyes pausing briefly on the desk. "Feels like your father could walk in any second." Mark forced a nod, gripping the drawer key hidden in his pocket, praying his uncle could not sense the tension boiling beneath his skin. They sat down at the desk, and Charles laid out documents concerning the estate, his tone calm but rehearsed. He spoke of debts, of properties that needed selling, of shares that should be transferred. His voice carried authority, the same voice that had guided Mark through countless decisions in the past. Yet behind every word Mark heard something else, a possible echo of his father's accusations. The urge to open the drawer and slam the journal onto the table nearly consumed him, but he remained silent, afraid of revealing his knowledge too soon. Charles leaned closer at one point, lowering his voice. "You should let me handle most of this. People are circling like vultures, waiting for you to make a mistake. I can shield you from them." The phrase sounded more like a threat than an offer. That night, after Charles left, Mark walked through the town streets trying to clear his head, but the journal's words stalked him like shadows. He passed the bakery where his father once argued with a business partner, the bar where debts had been whispered about, the church where condolences had been spoken with practiced sympathy. Everywhere he looked, he saw faces mentioned in the journal, some smiling, some turning away too quickly. He decided he had to test the truth, to see if his father's words had weight beyond paranoia. The next day, he sought out Mrs. O'Hara, the elderly neighbor who had lived beside the family for decades and who was known for remembering every feud that had ever flared in the community. She invited him in with a cautious smile, but when Mark mentioned his father's disputes, her expression hardened. "Best to leave old wounds buried," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father wasn't entirely innocent, you know. He liked to stir trouble. Some people never forgave him, but what good will it do to stir it all again?" Mark pressed, asking about Charles, about business partners, about betrayals, but her eyes darted to the window as though someone might be listening. Finally, she placed her hand on his arm. "Be careful, Mark. People in this town keep secrets for a reason." He left her house more unsettled than before, sensing that silence was not merely caution but fear. Days passed, and each attempt at conversation revealed more resistance. Former employees of his father's company avoided his questions, neighbors claimed ignorance, and even old friends cut conversations short. It was as if the entire town had signed an unspoken pact to keep him blind. But what frightened him more was that Charles seemed aware of his every step. Twice Mark caught sight of his uncle's car idling at the corner near his home, and once, while leaving the library, he noticed Charles speaking quietly with Leah, who turned away quickly when Mark approached. The paranoia that had consumed his father was now sinking its claws into him. One evening, as Mark was locking up the study, he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Peering through the window, he saw two men standing near the gate, smoking, their faces hidden by the glow of their cigarettes. They lingered too long to be strangers. When he stepped onto the porch, they vanished into the shadows without a word. That night he opened the journal again, flipping desperately through the pages, searching for guidance. One passage stood out. "They will watch you. They will test you. They will drive you into silence. But the truth is heavier than their threats. If you carry it with fire." The words read like prophecy. Determined, Mark decided to gather evidence from the past himself. He broke into his father's old filing cabinet in the basement, prying open rusted drawers, pulling out contracts, letters, receipts. Most were mundane, but tucked in one envelope was a photocopy of a signed agreement that contradicted the public story of the business collapse. It bore Charles's signature alongside that of a man his father had claimed was the true saboteur. Proof, or at least a spark of it. But as he studied it under the dim light, the phone rang. It was Leah, her voice shaking. "Mark, whatever you're doing, stop. Uncle Charles is furious. He said you're digging where you shouldn't. Please, just let it go before it gets worse." The line went dead before he could reply. He sat there, holding both the journal and the document, torn between silence and exposure. At that moment, the power in the house flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. From outside came the crunch of footsteps approaching the porch. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking this time. The footsteps on the porch paused, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment Mark thought his heart might explode from the silence pressing against the walls. He clutched the journal and the incriminating document, waiting for the door to crash open, but instead came a faint knock, strangely polite. Against his better judgment, He opened the door, bracing himself for Charles or one of his men. Instead, he found a young woman standing there, her hair damp from the rain, clutching a leather satchel. "You don't know me," she said quickly, her eyes scanning the darkness behind her as though she had been followed. "My name's Clara. I used to work for your father." Mark froze, unsure whether to trust her, but she pushed past him and closed the door as if her safety depended on it. "They'll be watching the house," she whispered. "I didn't think you'd last this long before they came for you." She set the satchel on the desk and pulled out a folder of papers, yellowed with age. Inside were letters exchanged between his father and Charles, arguments about money, accusations of theft, even references to missing funds that had been blamed on his father. Clara explained in a rush that she had been his father's secretary years ago, sworn to silence after threats were made against her family. "I couldn't speak then, but I can now. I heard everything, every phone call, every plan. Your father wasn't paranoid. He was cornered." Mark listened, stunned, flipping through the letters that aligned with passages in the journal, the handwriting and dates confirming the story. Clara continued. "Charles wanted the business for himself. When your father refused to sell, Charles manufactured debts, forged signatures, and spread rumors that drove investors away. When your father tried to expose him, no one would listen. The town depends on Charles's money. They're afraid of him." The weight of her words crashed against Mark's chest, fueling both fury and dread. If Charles truly orchestrated everything, then the journal was more than the ramblings of a bitter man. It was a warning. Clara insisted she had kept duplicates of documents hidden for years, waiting for the right time. "I thought the truth would die with him. But now you're here, and you need to decide if you'll bury it or burn everything down." Mark asked why she was risking herself now, and she lowered her gaze. "Because he asked me to. Your father told me, if anything happened to him, I should come to you when you were ready. He said you'd know when the lies started choking you." Her confession shook him more than the documents themselves, as though his father had planned for this exact moment. Mark felt both grateful and crushed, realizing how little he had truly understood the weight his father carried. But Clara's presence ignited a new fire in him. No longer was he fumbling blindly. Now he had a witness, an ally, and tangible proof. Together, they began mapping connections late into the night, cross-referencing journal entries with her notes. Names emerged. Investors who profited from the collapse, lawyers who altered contracts, even townsfolk who had silently accepted bribes to spread rumors. Each revelation painted Charles as not only manipulative but ruthless, capable of orchestrating a conspiracy that had destroyed one life to enrich many. Yet just as hope flickered, fear returned. Mark noticed headlights sweep across the window, a car idling too long outside. Clara stiffened. "They know I'm here." They extinguished the lamps and waited in silence until the car drove away, but unease remained. Clara warned him, "Once Charles realizes you have me, he'll stop playing polite. He'll come for both of us." Mark wanted to believe they could turn everything over to the authorities, but even Clara laughed bitterly. "Do you really think the sheriff isn't on his payroll? Do you think judges don't owe him favors? The law won't save you. Only exposure will." That night Mark dreamt of fire, the words of the journal burning into his mind. If you carry it with fire. When he woke, Clara was still there, sorting papers with quiet determination. For the first time since his father's death, he felt less alone. By dawn, they had a plan: gather every piece of evidence, compile the story, and find someone outside the town who could not be silenced. But before they could act, a knock thundered against the door, this time not polite but violent, rattling the hinges. Clara shoved the documents back into the satchel and whispered urgently, "It's him. He won't wait anymore." The journal lay open on the desk, its final entry underlined twice. "When the house trembles, the truth is at the door." The pounding on the door shook the house like a heartbeat gone wild, each thud echoing through the hollow rooms until Mark thought the walls themselves might splinter. Clara's hand gripped his arm, her nails biting into his skin, but neither of them moved. The second knock was louder, a voice calling his name, Charles's voice, smooth and steady, laced with the authority of a man who had never once needed to ask permission. "Mark, open the door. We need to talk." It wasn't a request. Mark froze, the journal and satchel clutched to his chest, torn between flight and defiance. Clara whispered that they should escape through the back, but he knew the men outside would be waiting. If we run now, they'll hunt us like animals, he hissed. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his father's warnings settling fully on his shoulders. He moved to the desk, stuffed the journal inside the satchel, and pressed it into Clara's hands. If anything happens, you run. Don't look back. She shook her head fiercely, refusing, but the third knock silenced their argument. The sound of wood splintering followed, the door frame cracking under the force of a shoulder or a boot. Mark realized Charles wasn't coming in alone. He was bringing the whole house down. They had seconds at best. Clara tugged him toward the staircase, and they scrambled upstairs just as the front door crashed open below. Voices filled the house, footsteps heavy and deliberate, men searching each room with the confidence of wolves in their own territory. Mark pulled Clara into his father's study, locking the door even though he knew it would not hold. The smell of dust and old whiskey clung to the air, mingling with their fear. He pressed his ear to the floor and heard Charles's voice rise, calm but carrying. You've been reading things you shouldn't, Mark. I told you to trust me. I told you I'd protect you. But you've decided to make yourself an enemy. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes burning with defiance. She whispered that they had to get the papers out, that the only way to survive was to spread the truth faster than Charles could silence it. Mark nodded, his mind racing, but every path felt blocked. Phones could be tapped, mail intercepted, friends already bought. He thought of the passage in the journal about carrying fire, and for a moment he understood. Exposure had to be absolute, unstoppable, like a blaze that consumed everything. The lock rattled as heavy fists hammered against the study door. Mark shoved a chair under the handle, then dragged Clara toward the window overlooking the backyard. They climbed onto the roof, the cold night air stinging their faces, and crouched low as flashlights swept the ground below. Charles's men fanned out, shadows against the trees, searching with quiet precision. Clara pressed the satchel to her chest, as though it were her child. They crawled along the shingles toward the garage roof, planning to drop down unseen, but just as Mark swung his leg over the edge, a shout cut through the night. A flashlight beam blinded him, and a voice barked, "They're up there." The chase erupted instantly. Clara leapt down, stumbling but keeping hold of the satchel, while Mark followed, pain shooting through his ankle as he landed hard. They sprinted into the woods behind the house, branches whipping their faces, the sound of pursuit crashing closer with every step. The night became a blur of breathless terror, the journal's weight dragging on Mark's shoulder as if the past itself resisted being carried. Finally, they collapsed near a creek, gasping for air. Clara insisted they had to keep moving, but Mark could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the tremble in her hands. He wanted to believe they could outpace Charles's men, but he knew the truth. They were being herded, driven like cattle toward some inevitable trap. And then, as if to confirm his fear, headlights blazed through the trees ahead, cutting off their path. Charles stepped into the beam, his figure calm, almost casual, as if the night's violence were nothing more than a necessary chore. He called out to Mark, his voice steady. "You think that book will save you? It will damn you. Your father filled your head with poison, and now you've swallowed it whole. Come with me. Give me the satchel, and I can make this disappear." No one has to know the lies he told. Mark's throat tightened, rage and grief twisting together. Clara clutched his arm, whispering for him not to listen, but Charles's words pierced deeper than he wanted to admit. What if the journal was just venom, the ravings of a broken man desperate to drag his brother down? What if Mark was about to destroy everything on the word of a ghost? His hesitation cost them. Two men emerged from the darkness behind, grabbing Clara, wrenching the satchel from her hands. She screamed and fought, but one struck her hard across the face, sending her crumpling to the ground. Mark lunged, only to be caught in a brutal grip that forced him to his knees. Charles walked closer, taking the satchel from his men with a measured calm. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and shook his head almost sadly. He made you just like him. Obsessed, angry, weak. He tossed the satchel into the mud, then raised his hand, and for a moment Mark thought he might signal for the end. But instead Charles crouched, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You have one chance, Mark. Forget this ever happened. Walk away, and I will forgive you. Keep fighting, and you won't just lose your inheritance. you'll lose everything. Mark stared at Clara, blood trickling from her temple, her eyes pleading with him to choose defiance. His father's words thundered in his skull, the final entry blazing like fire. When the house trembles, the truth is at the door. And here, in the forest, beneath the gaze of the man who had orchestrated ruin, the truth had arrived. The silence in the woods seemed to stretch forever, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing and the distant hum of engines idling, waiting. Mark's knees pressed into the damp earth, his arms pinned behind him by Charles's men, but his mind felt sharper than it ever had before, as if every thought was etched in fire. Charles stood over him, calm and immovable, his presence a wall Mark could not climb. "This is your last chance," Charles said quietly, almost fatherly, as though offering a gift instead of an ultimatum. "Give me your loyalty, and this ends tonight. You'll have peace, a life, a future." He gestured toward Clara, still half-conscious on the ground, her face pale under the moonlight. "She can walk away, too, if you choose wisely. But defy me, and you know what happens." Mark felt his father's words echoing, rising from the journal like smoke in his lungs. "He will take everything from you if you let him. He will make you his echo or his prey." Mark's chest burned with the memory of those words, the weight of them. He stared at Clara, blood on her cheek, her hand trembling in the dirt as she tried to push herself up. Their eyes locked, and though her lips barely moved, he read the word, fight. He knew then there could be no middle ground, no compromise with a man who had spent a lifetime bending truth until it snapped. Charles reached down, gripping Mark's chin, forcing his face upward. His voice lowered, like a whisper only the two of them could hear. "You're not your father, Mark. You don't have his strength. You don't have his vision. You'll destroy yourself chasing his madness. But you can be mine. My blood. My heir." The word heir twisted in Mark's gut. For years he had longed for recognition, for family, for some proof that he belonged, but hearing it now made bile rise in his throat. He spat in the dirt, and Charles's eyes narrowed, the softness vanishing in an instant. The command came sharp as a blade. "End him." The men hauled Mark to his feet, their grips like iron. Clara screamed, launching herself at one of them, clawing wildly, forcing him back for a heartbeat before being slammed down again. That split second was all Mark needed. Rage surged, a feral strength that tore through his hesitation. He twisted free from one grip, drove his shoulder into the other man, and wrenched himself loose. Pain seared his wrists where the hands had dug in, but freedom was enough. He lunged for the satchel in the mud, scooping it up with shaking hands. The journal pressed against his chest, wet and heavy, as if demanding to be used. Charles's shout split the air, furious now. "Don't let him leave." Guns lifted, safety catches clicked, the night charged with death. Mark's mind raced. He could run, vanish into the woods, try to escape with Clara and the journal. But he knew the network Charles commanded. There was no hiding from a man like him. The only weapon Mark had was the truth, and the only way to wield it was now. He pulled the journal free, flipping to the last pages, and shouted with a rawness that tore his throat. "I know what you did, Charles. I know how you forged the signatures, how you buried the debts, how you stole it all." His voice carried into the night, echoing off the trees, louder than he believed himself capable of. "Your empire is built on lies, and I have the proof. Every word of it." Charles froze, eyes narrowing, but Mark pressed on, louder, desperate, relentless. He read passages, damning lines about bank accounts, about payoffs, about betrayals that could topple everything. The men hesitated, their grips faltering, their eyes flicking between their master and the trembling young man screaming his father's words into the night. Doubt crackled in the air, sharp as lightning before the storm breaks. Charles's control wavered, his authority cracking as the truth spilled free like a wound he could no longer hide. "Lies," he roared, but his voice had lost its steel. "All of it lies from a bitter man." But the words sounded hollow, desperate, even to his own men. One of them shifted uneasily, his gun lowering slightly, and in that moment Mark felt power shift, just an inch, but enough to know it could topple. Clara dragged herself to his side, clutching his arm, blood streaking her face, but fire in her eyes. Together they stood, backs pressed, defying the circle of men. Charles's face contorted, rage consuming his mask of calm. He snatched the journal from Mark's hands, ripping the pages out, tearing them to shreds with a fury that bordered on madness. "You think this paper will save you?" he screamed, the fragments scattering like ash in the wind. "Truth is what men believe, and they will believe me." Mark's heart broke at the sight, his father's words dissolving into nothing, but Clara grabbed his hand, whispering fiercely, "It's not the paper. It's you. You carry it now." Her words ignited something in him, something larger than fear. For the first time, he understood what his father meant. The journal was not the weapon, the bearer was. His voice, his defiance, his refusal to be silenced. Mark stepped forward, his eyes locked on Charles, his voice steady as a blade. "Then you'll have to kill me in front of all of them, because I'm done living under your shadow." The men froze, caught in the chasm between loyalty and doubt. The night held its breath. Charles raised his hand, his face twisted with hate, and gave the order that would seal everything. "Then die." The gunshot cracked the night open like glass shattering, and for a heartbeat Mark was certain it was his end, certain the darkness rushing toward him was death. But when his eyes blinked open, still alive, he saw one of Charles's men lowering his weapon, the barrel pointed not at Mark but at the ground, smoke curling away in silence. The man's hand trembled as he muttered, "I didn't sign up for this. Not for family blood." Another shifted, uneasy, his loyalty cracking under the weight of everything Mark had shouted. Charles spun toward them, his rage volcanic, his voice booming with betrayal. "Traitors! You think you can turn against me now, after all I've given you?" But his fury only deepened their hesitation. Clara squeezed Mark's hand, her grip iron despite her wounds, urging him not to falter now. Mark's chest heaved, his voice rising again, raw and unshaken. "You've taken everything from us, Charles. You tried to rewrite history, but tonight it ends. Your power dies with your lies." Charles lunged for him, teeth bared, hands clawing like an animal, but Mark braced himself. The two collided in the mud, grappling in a frenzy of fists and fury, father and son bound in violence, as old as their blood. Charles was stronger, hardened by decades of control, but Mark fought with something Charles had never understood, the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose but his truth. Clara screamed, darting forward, striking Charles with a jagged branch, giving Mark the opening he needed. He drove his fist into Charles's jaw, another into his gut, and with a surge of rage years in the making, he shoved him back into the dirt. For a moment Charles lay there, gasping, the mask of invincibility stripped away, nothing left but a bitter, broken man. He spat blood and hatred, rasping through clenched teeth. "You'll regret this. They always come back. Men like me don't disappear, we return." Mark stared at him, breathing hard, rain beginning to fall, washing the blood and dirt from his face. He wanted to believe Charles was wrong, that this moment would finally end the nightmare, but a shadow in his gut whispered otherwise. Clara pulled him back, urging him to leave before the men could rally, before Charles could find strength again. They stumbled into the trees, Mark clutching the torn remains of the journal, pages ruined but words alive in his memory. Behind them, the night echoed with shouts, arguments, the sound of a kingdom crumbling as loyalty fractured. For the first time, Mark felt the grip of Charles's empire loosening, but it came with no joy, only exhaustion and the heavy ache of loss. Days later, in the quiet of a small, nameless town, Mark and Clara sat together in a rented room, the silence between them thick with unspoken truths. Her wounds had begun to heal, though the scars would remain, reminders of what they had endured. The journal, now nothing more than a bundle of ruined paper, lay on the table between them, still carrying the faint smell of smoke and rain. Mark traced the edges with his fingertips, whispering, "I thought this would save us. That if I shouted loud enough, the world would finally hear." Clara leaned closer, her voice steady though her eyes carried sorrow. They did hear Mark. Maybe not all of them, not yet, but enough. Enough to crack his hold. That's how it begins. He nodded, but his heart was restless. He remembered his father's final notes, the way the old man had warned him. Truth is a fire. It warms, it destroys, and it always spreads. Mark wondered if he had truly lit a fire, or only scattered ashes into the wind. The following weeks blurred together, Whispers of Charles's downfall filtering through distant contacts, fragments of news stories hinting at investigations, rumors of men abandoning him, of debts surfacing, of foundations shaking. Yet Mark knew Charles was not gone, not entirely. Men like him were too deeply rooted, too skilled at survival. He could run, he could hide, but the shadow would always loom until someone chose to finish it. One night, unable to sleep, Mark sat by the window, watching rain streak the glass, and spoke softly to Clara, though she was half asleep. What if I just become him? What if carrying this truth makes me as obsessed, as consumed, as broken? Her voice, slurred with fatigue but piercing, answered in the dark. Then you choose not to. That's the difference. You choose. Mark let the words settle, heavy yet freeing. His father's journal was gone, its ink dissolved, its pages lost, but the legacy of it lived in choices now his to make. He could let vengeance define him, or he could build something new, scarred but honest. Still, even as he held Clara's hand, even as he promised himself a different path, a question haunted him like a ghost he could never bury. When the time came, when Charles returned from the shadows, would Mark be strong enough to face him again without becoming the very monster he swore to destroy? The rain kept falling, soft and endless, as if the world itself refused to give him an answer.